Welcome to Introduction to Political Science. This is the first lecture covering the introductory chapter in Craig Parsons' book titled Introduction to Political Science, How to Think for Yourself About Politics. So we're going to do a lot of things in this class, but the main thrust of it is to teach ourselves critical thinking and to be able to look at politics with kind of a fresh insight and a new way to evaluate information politically as it comes to us. So that's the main thing that we'll be doing as we proceed through the course. So a little bit about me. My name is Melissa Bice, and this is my second year at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. I got my PhD in 2013 at the University of Tennessee. My major area of concentrations throughout my graduate education were international relations and comparative politics. My research centers around the role of gender and race and indigenous activism in Latin America. Those are my major areas of expertise. I do like teaching this course, though, which allows me to kind of spread out and teach all of the different subfields, which we'll talk about momentarily. So how you can reach me, the best way is through email. I try to answer my emails usually within 24 hours. And another option you can find me is from 11 till 12, Monday through Friday on the chat function on Canvas. So either of these ways will put you in touch with me, and don't feel bad if you have to send a second one. Sometimes they do get past me. So if you haven't heard back from me in 24 hours, do send a second email. Hopefully this is summer and that won't be necessary though. The title of the book we're using is Introduction to Political Science, How to Think for Yourself About Politics. You can use any edition of this book and also any version, meaning paperback, hardback, online, whatever works for you and whatever is actually cheapest. This is the inner cover of that book for more information. So before we establish what political science is, maybe it's a good idea to do some basic definitions on what we even think politics is. And, there are lots of ideas that people have when they talk about politics. A lot of people think about government. A lot of people think about elections. But politics really is a more general concept than that. For the purposes of scholarship, we think of it as collective decision making. Anytime major decisions have to be made by a group of people in any context, that's a sort of scholarly understanding of it. A real-world understanding of politics, really, though, is power. The simplest definition is who has the ability to make someone else do something they would otherwise not do. That is the definition of power. And that then is the definition of politics. And so there are a lot of negative and positive connotations that go along with political science and the topic of political science, which is politics. And a lot of people equate it with immoral behavior, trickery, corruption. And while that is all true, and one would think that the more enlightened of us would escape it somehow and go live in the woods and not even get engaged in some of the terrible catfighting that happens over politics. But the reality is that politics is everywhere. It infects all of our lives. It's a factor that influences your everyday existence, including things like your sales tax, how long it takes for you to get a driver's license at the DMV. All of these are extremely political in nature because people made decisions that impact these experiences that you have. So at some point, all of this boils down to power. And as a science, as a study, we try to focus on the things that give context to how power is exchanged or taken away from people or created, or how equality of power comes about. So there are a lot of themes related to this question of politics. And again, while we're not necessarily thrilled with some of the topics and some of the major problems associated with politics, it's not necessarily something that good people, bad people, neutral people have the option of escaping. So, a critical view of all of this is necessary. If you can't escape it, then what do you do with the information? So, you learn to think for yourself, and you learn to get as much power as you can by getting as much information as you can. Well, you need, as much as you can train yourself, a neutral filter for that so that you don't become victim to things like propaganda or the oft cited fake news that we keep hearing about. So, critical thinking requires, first of all, that you are able to consider the alternative point of view, something that you might disagree with. Very difficult. We have, as humans, mechanisms built in to our psychology to stop that from happening, things like confirmation bias. So we combat these with a couple of different things, a couple of tools, intellectual tools within political science. Descriptive study of politics, being as neutral and laying out the information as best as we can. But we also use normative politics. We draw on theories and philosophies from writers who came before us, observing different types of government and different failures of those types of government, and we try to adapt those for how those work in the real world today. So as a science, political science tries to systematically approach gathering about information about political systems and analyzing them with a neutral vision, with a neutral perspective, so that causes of phenomena can be found. So one of the very important things that you have to learn to do is to divorce yourself somewhat from your own personal feelings toward things and look at things as neutrally as possible. Remove your own personal biases from things. And that can be quite difficult to do. And that's why critical thinking is a skill. It's not something we're born with. It's something that we actually have to develop. So I encourage you to be patient with yourself as you encounter this. There are frustrating topics that you have to engage with in this study. But science kind of gives us a little bit of an emotional break because we're only trying to explain these things. We're not trying to justify anything. We're not trying to excuse anything. We're just trying to take us to that next step of knowledge that helps us understand social problems, political problems, and perhaps at some point find a solution to them. One thing that helps us with this issue of critical thinking are these sort of 3 mental exercises that we can do when faced with any political situation, any political issue. There are 3 basic ways that, or motivations behind decisions, 3 classes of those types of thinking processes. And these 3 classes are the rational material approach, the institutional approach, and the ideational approach. And essentially, in any political issue, you can find all 3 of these in operation. But you'll often find when you gather more information that one of these has kind of a stronger explanatory power than the other 2. So this can be helpful in our analysis of politics. Very briefly, the rational material approach is going to be seeking any explanation that engages conflict over material resources. That can be wealth, it can be land, it can be anything of that matter. At the same time, there's another kind of related at times, which is the institutional approach, which tells us how those resources might get distributed and the rules around how decisions get made. So institutional structures like the legal processes, the Constitution of the United States, these are all institutional type explanations. So anything that relates to the rules of how a game is done or a business is run. And the ideational explanation is a little easier to explain because it's essentially any cultural or ideological influence on the decision. So when you're looking at a political case, a political question, and you're weighing the answers about which caused a certain outcome, then looking at these 3 in turn, which one of them seems to be the more influential, can help us take that next step in kind of becoming more divorced from our feelings and critically analyzing things. So in a lot of spots in your book, mostly at the end of the chapter, cases in political science are taken and deconstructed using these three different approaches to political science. And they've chosen the 2013 shutdown, which I'm not sure if anyone remembers, but there was a standoff between the Obama administration at this time and the Republican-controlled Congress. The two major sticking points that they couldn't come to an agreement on, and that was healthcare and immigration. So this leads to government shutdown, and why does that happen? Well, one possible explanation is the rational material approach. There were resources involved, especially if we're talking about the healthcare issue, and the healthcare plan proposed by Democrats really seemed to violate what a lot of the voters for the Republican Party at that time did. Those people tend to earn more money than the majority of Democratic voters. So that kind of represents this idea of class conflict, the conflict between lower class and upper class people. So the explanation here is that the parties are basically just playing out this drama. The institutional approach points to the fact that the institutional design of the United States is set up so that this actually happens quite frequently. When someone from two fairly equal houses of decision making, the executive and the legislature, are controlled by different parties, you have a situation we know as gridlock. And it's very rare for legislation to get passed in a situation like that, but it's also not that uncommon for the government to shut down the government because they can't come to agreement over the budget, which is often held in kind of a hostage situation. So that's the institutional explanation. The rules allowed it to happen. And then an ideological approach, which does somewhat cross over with the rational material. The idea of what a government's responsibility is from the Republican standpoint is not to provide for health care, whereas the Democrats feel that it is because it is a public issue. So these are some of the ways that, in a very brief fashion, you can analyze what the different motivations are within any political case. Now, if you wanted to go further, you would go out and collect as much data as possible to convince me of one or the other. So you could use those approaches to explain any number of things. You could use them to explain the outcome of the 2016 election. There have been a lot of analyses that have discussed the waning Midwestern states in terms of their economy and the kind of pressure that was put on them, and they switched from Democrat to Republican. The explanation of the Electoral College is an institutional rule that allowed Donald Trump to win the presidency in spite of a popular vote loss. That's institutional. And then ideological, I think we saw lots of that when we talked about feminism or culture wars, or a lot of the issues that were related to what the government should do, government handouts, things that the kind of dog whistle terms that you hear uttered in campaigns are very often kind of reproducing ideological viewpoints. And so it's very important to pay attention to those. Again, you're just trying to soak in this information. You're not trying to decide whether it's right or wrong. You're just trying to tell what it is. You're trying to be honest about influences on certain things. So that's a very important point. In political science, we try to be what we call empirical. We try to make our studies around empirical questions. And empirical really just means that which you can observe. A normative study is more situated around what should be done. And we'll talk about that more. There are some elements, some areas of our study where we do expressly do that. But when we're talking about behavioral science, and for the majority of what political science does, we are trying not to endorse one side or the other, one idea or the other. The idea is to teach you how to think for yourself.